This was a definition written out by John Kabat-Zinn. And so John Kabat-Zinn was almost what many people consider the Western father of mindfulness. He kind of devised the first MBSR, so Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Program in 1979, and when he was working as a professor in Massachusetts. So John defines mindfulness as paying attention on purpose to the present moment non-judgmentally.
Hello everyone. Today I'm joined by Josh Reynolds, who embodies the values of thinkers and performers by balancing high performance in a fast-paced career with mindfulness and sustainable self-development. After graduating with a truly multidisciplinary background from Warwick University, completing his BSc in Physics with Business and MSc in Innovation and Entrepreneurship, he embarked on a career in the big tech. He then worked for 4.5 years at Amazon, followed by additional 2 years at Meta, developing his expertise in business development and partnerships. As he's strongly passionate about mindfulness and self-development, he used his time during the pandemic to become a career mentor and a certified mindfulness teacher. In the latter role, he practiced mindfulness-based interventions as a natural way to reduce incidences of anxiety and depression. As he's also had an opportunity to travel and work remotely during the past 3 years, his new professional mission is to promote new ways of working as Senior Partnerships Manager at Remote. During today's interview, I am particularly excited to learn about the science behind mindfulness and how the techniques can be applied to cope with stressful career and a fast-paced life. Thank you for joining me today, Josh. I'm very excited for our chat.
Yeah, likewise. I appreciate you having me on, Alex.
My absolute pleasure. So today, I would like to start by kind of appreciating you had and you still have a great business journey in the technology companies in the partnership space. But you are also a mindfulness teacher, which is what intrigued me about your profile and why I'm really excited to talk to you today. I guess my first question would be, what made you personally interested in this field, and how does mindfulness actually benefit your career, if it does at all?
Sure. Yeah, no, happy to chat around that a little bit. I think largely, in my opinion, I think people come into mindfulness through two avenues. I think, there are some people who are super fortunate and it's kind of been ingrained in their upbringing. Potentially their parents are on the more like quote unquote alternative side, maybe like spiritually inclined. So they've been brought up with perhaps like Eastern philosophy being chatted about around the table. And so meditation might have been something they've done from a young age. And I think, in adult populations, it's much easier to kind of percolate that through your life if that's been your upbringing. But I think the other cohort of people, and this is in my experience from seeing peers and whatnot, is you're probably forced into it through some internal reckoning or experience that has caused you to like look for some support that you're not finding through other avenues. So that was kind of my journey into mindfulness and meditation. I was, I guess, growing up and struggling to understand the world and my place in it. I think I was struggling to reckon with the way I defined myself and the way I interacted with society, like the level of reactivity I had in certain situations. And for me, I dabbled in meditation. I engaged in the app-based world, the headspaces, the calms, balance, whatever it might be. And I think a lot of people do that, and you end up going in dribs and drabs, and you do 5 minutes here and 5 minutes there. And I could never really build anything consistent. And it was when I had, in my mid-20s, I had, I guess, what I would call quite a significant mental breakdown, set of mental challenges that caused me to take some time off work. And I really struggled to reconcile the person that I was before this versus the person that I became after this. It opened I'd never really been an anxious person, and this event kind of opened me up to a world of anxiety and inner doubt and existentialism about, well, why do we get so involved in the grind? Why doesn't everyone just seek happiness? Why do we treat each other like we do? These really big questions that become quite overwhelming. And so kind of fast forwarding a little bit, I ended up trying loads of different therapeutic methods to help myself. I was trying CBT, counseling, psychotherapy. And eventually I found a psychotherapist who'd been trained in mindfulness-based psychotherapy. And it also happened that she'd been a Buddhist for most of her life. And so when we started on the psychotherapeutic journey, we quickly realized that we had this kind of shared interest in common of Buddhism and Eastern spirituality. So we ended up kind of straddling these sessions where it would be part meditation and her being, for want of a better word, my guru, and part being kind of classical psychotherapy. And that really cemented my practice. I ended up quite easily with her as my mentor, getting into meditation and mindfulness, every day. And I would do, again, I don't like to like exaggerate how long people meditate for, because I don't think and we'll get into this later, you don't need to meditate for really long periods of time for it to have benefit. But, I would do between like 20 minutes to an hour a day. And it was really, and I was going to the London Buddhist Center and I'm really leaning into that side of things. So that's how I came to do it. So, so she really helped me build my practice. And then it wasn't until 2 or 3 years later, after being involved in the Buddhist Center, that I found out about the Oxford Mindfulness Foundation. And so the OMF is essentially a kind of mindfulness organization that was spun out of Oxford University. They look to combine a lot of the neuroscientific learnings from Oxford with like Eastern philosophy and Buddhism to create these like holistic teachings, which were grounded in science, but were also like very, based in mindfulness and meditation. And that's where I ended up training, doing some training for my teaching practice. And then the other part was at the Central England College of Mindfulness. So that's kind of my way into it, in a roundabout way. And in terms of the latter part of your question, how this helps me in my career, it's deeply helpful. For me, I think, and you live in London as well. We've both been involved in this environment that is the grind and the hustle culture, and it can be very fast. And I think with mindfulness, it allowed me to take a step back from this pace. And you can be going in the city for 10 years and end up stepping back and realize you have no idea where you are. You've never taken stock of your long-term goals, your aspirations. You don't even know if you're really like working towards what you truly believe in anymore. And being able to kind of take a place inside yourself that allows you to process these things and these events and really align with your true happiness and true being. It made navigating the workplace so much more easy for me. And that's at a high level. Obviously there's the day-to-day benefits of, I feel more balanced in relationships. I find it easier to communicate. I manage my stress better. And the kind of classical things that you associate with that.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for sharing and being so open about it. I feel like I also want to maybe give you perspective why I got interested in the topic as well. Because I find it quite fascinating how our perspectives are different at the root, but then quite similar in terms of application and benefits. So you've mentioned there are two people that have that maybe got to learn about mindfulness techniques and more about Eastern philosophy. So I'm the former, actually. My parents were quite involved into Eastern philosophy and meditation and spiritual. Like there was more focus on the spiritual side of life. But as a kid, who wants to kind of rebel in his teens against the parents, basically disregarded all of this. I was like, no, this is some crap. This is not working. My parents are crazy, basically, like type of thinking. Then I entered the city, I was hungry. I wanted to perform as much as possible. And then I also had a crisis. I think it's been 4 or 5 years ago. Like I was almost on the brink of burnout, basically, in my first graduate job. And then I reminded myself of what has been going on at my dinner table and what my family was trying to teach me 7 years earlier in reality. And then it was quite funny, actually, and quite nice to reconnect with my parents and ask them about things that they were mentioning. Can you teach me a bit more? Can you share a bit more? So it was quite nice, actually, spiritual journey for me to reconnect with my parents' teachings and kind of see value in what they were trying to tell me, but when I was actually ready for it, not when I was a teen and I wasn't interested in spiritual life. And then in terms of the benefits, and from that point onwards, when I started to appreciate those things, I think my journey was very similar to yours. It's about calming down my thoughts. It's about segregating things, also getting the external perspective, or just getting perspective on things and zooming out almost from the hectic everyday life that we can be entangled in every day. So moving back on the things we wanted to discuss, just to keep us on track, right? Making sure we don't miss out any good points. You've mentioned, and I think we both mentioned and acknowledged stress, anxiety that can appear living in London, hustling, fast-paced environment, fighting for the promotion, thinking about your career, trying to do well for yourself, but at the same time without necessarily losing what really matters in life. How would you define those psychological states of stress and anxiety? How do they present themselves in everyday life based on your learnings and teachings as a mindfulness teacher?
Yeah, great question. I think I realized we should probably take one quick step back before taking a step forward and just define mindfulness perhaps for your audience, because I think there's a lot of different definitions, and I think I have a really brilliant simplistic one, which is this was a definition written out by Jon Kabat-Zinn, and so Jon Kabat-Zinn was almost what many people consider the Western father of mindfulness. He kind of devised the first MBSR, so mindfulness-based stress reduction program in 1979, and when he was working as a professor in Massachusetts. So John defines mindfulness as paying attention on purpose to the present moment, non-judgmentally. So it's kind of it's intentional, so it's the on purpose. It's without judgment, so whatever it happens is purely happening and you are the observer. You're not letting your personal biases and experiences get wrapped up in that. And it's in the present, so it's what's happening to you right now, your body, your mind, around you, as opposed to thinking about future or past. So I think that's the most simplistic definition of mindfulness, and maybe that will help us as we go forward. So I think
definitely.
Does that kind of make sense?
100%. I think the non-judgmental part is quite important. Well, I think the whole definition is important, but that stands out to me because it's so easy to take things personal or get involved into thoughts with your emotions. And I think taking that objective perspective that you mentioned is really important to find peace. I would call it that way. Correct me if you want.
No, I entirely agree with you. I think the most difficult thing, and the thing that people, from my teaching and anecdotally, the thing that people struggle with the most about mindfulness is trying to remove, and I guess this is almost the if we really want to deem it the ultimate goal of enlightenment. I hate to use that word because it's so like far flung for many people, but I think is the ultimate separation between yourself and the stories, the narratives that you tell yourself inside your head. Being able to be the pure observer of everything that happens in your mind and outside of it is kind of the goal, the ultimate goal, and it's so difficult, like you say.
100% agree. 100% agree.
Anyway, I realized, sorry, I derailed us a little bit, so I think we were talking about defining
it was
stress.
Very helpful.
We were talking about defining stress and anxiety. Yeah, no, I think there's two really good ways to do this in the context of our discussion. I think one is kind of what a psychologist would tell you, and then I think one, because it bears relevance on our later discussion when we talk about some of the research involved in mindfulness, is more the biologist's definition, i.e., what's going on in the brain circuitry as you're feeling stressed. So on the one hand, a psychologist, typically, I think the American Psychological Association would define this as stress typically has a trigger. So stress, when we talk about stress, we think about more short term. There is a stressor involved. That could be anything. That could be you receive an email at work. Someone says something to you that doesn't agree with you, and you feel a tightness in your chest. You feel like, oh my God, this is a judgment about me. And usually that stress persists as long as the stressor is present, or as long as you are thinking about that. But typically, if you remove that, stress levels will go down and you'll return to normal. Whereas anxiety we would define as kind of stress without the presence of a stressor. So it can be more long-term underlying kind of symptoms that could arise at any moment. So the symptoms of both are very similar, whether it's chest tightness, heart palpitations, sweating, unable to sleep, these sorts of things. That's typically how I would, at least, that's the definition I feel is useful to separate those two apart.
So it's almost like anxiety is, you have the symptoms, but you don't really know why, right? Because stress is quite simple. Oh, something triggers me. Anxiety is more complex, and I've experienced it the same way. I can't sleep, or I'm just worried something bad's going to happen. I just don't know why I'm worried. How can we identify, or should we be identifying the underlying cause of that feeling of anxiety? And if we should be doing this, how can we do it? I guess would be my question out of interest.
That is a great question. And I think, typically, I think people typically tend to manage stress themselves a lot of the time. They see a stressor, they think, okay, this aggravates me. I will maybe remove myself from situations where I experience this stressor. It's quite, a direct relationship. Whereas I find anxiety is typically when people seek help from a professional. If it's persistent, you'll go to see a psychologist. And that's when I think delving into past experience and using things like mindfulness is really, really helpful, because it allows you to step back behind the voice and the stories of your mind and really tune into, and this is a practice that I have worked with quite a lot, really tune into where in the body the anxiety is arising. And you can often kind of give shape and sensation to this feeling. And by doing this, you can start to actually build a kind of character or a narrative around this anxiety in your body, and often trace this back to where it came from in your past life. So it's kind of a process of breaking yourself down to uncover the root cause. And I think it's quite, honestly, I think doing that on your own is, whilst some people can do it, I think it's really hard. It can be a scary journey. And I think often it does require guidance and support. So I think, and that's one of the things I think we'll definitely talk about later, is that support is what people need. And I think we lack the supportive structures. We're very good at society of dishing things up on a platter and saying, oh, but you have so many options to help you. But if you're not integrating support into these options, if you're not educating people on how to use them and navigate them and making it okay and acceptable, it's a complete moot point, if that makes sense.
100%. Definitely not for later in the discussion around adoption and providing support structure. I think we are taking a lot of good bullet points already to follow up on later. So thanks a lot for that. I guess, one of the questions, playing a devil's advocate a little bit, is, well, I want to ask, does it really work? But personally, I will be biased because I've seen the benefits of that working on myself. Yeah. But if we were to literally play a devil's advocate, right, and we imagine a person who doesn't believe in the soft science or maybe a psychological help without the help of the pharmaceuticals or medicine, and would describe mindfulness as the new age fad, feel good kind of trend to help people get better without actually helping them in the long term. What would we be able to respond to that person? Is there science behind proving mindfulness helping with stress and anxiety on a consistent basis?
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you asked, because I think again, that is a reason why people struggle to adopt meditation or mindfulness practice, because they maybe use an app, but what happens is people try an app or a series of mindfulness practices for a few weeks, maybe a month, and they see absolutely no change. And and therefore think it doesn't work. So I think there's a few, I'll take you almost in a chronological journey of how I think we can explain mindfulness actually being effective. So one, I always like to just mention, its history. Mindfulness, one of the big components of mindfulness is insight-based meditation, or any kind of meditation, really. It doesn't have to be purely insight-based. And Buddhists have been practicing this since 500 BC. So, 500 BC is kind of the roughly the big origins of Buddhism, with Siddhartha Gautama, and the very typical him meditating under a tree until he attained enlightenment. And this, I think, the fact that we still have monastic communities in every corner of the world today, teaching the benefits, and you can see, you read crazy stories about things that monks can achieve, like heating and cooling their bodies, feats of strength that you wouldn't believe. And so I think that's like the background for this discussion. But I think a skeptic could still say, well, that's too spiritual for me. That's nestled in too much religious belief, and I'm not religious, so maybe I don't pertain to that, which is fine. But so let's come forward a little bit, I think. And I was mentioning earlier Jon Kabat-Zinn. So Jon Kabat-Zinn was a professor at Massachusetts, one at the University of Massachusetts, and he saw a lot of patients with chronic pain, anxiety, depression, and he'd been kind of inducted into the school of Zen Buddhism years earlier. So he'd been, I think, at least 20 years he'd been practicing Zen Buddhism, and so he got to this point where he was like, you know what, I've seen such a benefit in my life and anecdotally heard it through my community that I'm going to try and kind of form a program to take these people through who are experiencing depression and anxiety and see what happens. So he kind of conceptualized this 8-week program, and he published a paper which I think was called The Effectiveness of Mindfulness on Generalized Anxiety. It was initially with 22 subjects. They did the 8-week program, and results were measured after, and 20 of 22 showed significant reductions in their levels of anxiety. And these are people who have been medicated extensively. And more amazingly, 3 years later, they did a follow-up to that study. And I think it was something like 80% of the people were still showing persistent improvements just from an 8-week course. So it's not just that mindfulness helps, it's that even if you do an 8-week course and you don't necessarily persist extensively in your mindfulness practice, that can still help your recovery from generalized anxiety conditions, which I think is incredible. And that was back in 1917. That was back in the pre-2000s. So there's been a lot more since then.
Absolutely. And you've mentioned earlier in our chat, right? I may not remember this institute, but Oxford
Mindfulness Foundation. Yeah.
The Mindfulness Foundation, right? So I believe, I'm not sure if that's something you would like to elaborate more on as well, but yeah, looks like they've linked mindfulness to pretty hard science with the neuroscientific basis, right? How mindfulness can affect brain processes and I don't know, biology, I would say probably, to to have the impact on the physical states of human body and how body works.
Yeah, and so I think there's so much more we could go into here. I think I feel like as a practitioner of these 8-week programs, I have to give a shout out to so Mark Williams was a professor at Oxford University, and back in 2002 he built on what Jon Kabat-Zinn had done, and he actually conceived. So Jon Kabat-Zinn had effectively birthed MBSR, so mindfulness-based stress reduction. Mark Williams in the early 2000s and a couple of other colleagues did the same, but they kind of integrated cognitive behavioral therapy into these 8-week courses, and thus came out with MBCT. But their study was they kind of broadened their study. So they took 145 patients with recurring meaning 3 or more episodes of depression, against a randomized kind of subject basis. They took them through an 8-week course, and for 77% of this sample, MBCT significantly reduced occurrences of relapse of kind of chronic depression, which is, again, staggering, even in contrast to pharmaceutical intervention.
That is staggering. I agree. I agree with the use of that word 100%. And I guess almost a natural follow-up from my side would be, can we go a bit more into the the biological science
Yeah.
of mindfulness. Is there? I've had an episode. I think it was second episode on my platform, but also I've read quite a lot about connection between the body and mind, basically what we think and basically the state of our psychological state can affect our physical state, especially if a psychological state persists for some time. If we are happy, if we are fulfilled, we become stronger, we become healthier, our skin even starts to glow. I think there was some research about that as well. If we become stressed, if we become anxious, you can, for many reasons, but psychology can also affect gut disease or indigestion and like heartburn, for example. So coming back to the question I want to ask, right? Can we discuss a bit more about how mindfulness might help with the physical health in terms of self-regulation of the body processes, reduced inflammation, potentially even better focus and cognitive power, if you have any evidence or examples of it?
Yeah, so I think one thing I think I kind of neglected to mention earlier was the biological processes that induce stress in the first place. So maybe we should just briefly give an overview of that for viewers and listeners. So briefly, you have what is called the HPA axis in the brain: hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal, and these are the kind of three connected brain structures, which, in conjunction with your amygdala, control stress response. So your amygdala, as people may have heard of, is like also known as the fear center in the brain. It's responsible for a lot of emotional processing. And so typically when you experience stress, when it's a non-chronic situation, you'll see something that stresses you out. The amygdala will send a signal to the hypothalamus, which is your control center. The hypothalamus kind of controls your autonomic nervous system, both parasympathetic to calm you down and sympathetic to energize you, to kind of give you drive. And so in a stressful situation, the hypothalamus will then communicate through the autonomic nervous system with your adrenal glands, causing them to reduce adrenaline, epinephrine. This then is like, effectively like pressing the accelerator on a car. Like this is when you get heart beating faster, you get excess energy, you get, tunnel vision, all these things that are like fight or flight symptoms. If that stressor persists, again, another signal is sent to the pituitary glands. They release a hormone called ACTH, which then again causes the adrenal glands to release cortisol, and again, cortisol is another one of those chemicals in the body that is inducing a stress response. So, and this can continue in kind of perpetuity, and in some senses, people have extremely sensitive amygdalas, for example, like oversensitized, and that when you can develop, I guess, like chronic stress that appears even when the thing that you see is not overly stressful. So I think that kind of prefaces the next part of the conversation. And pause me if I'm going too deep or too convoluted here, but I feel like, again, we need to introduce some other definitions, because some of the research that I'm about to mention talks about a few things. So that's the kind of stress center. The other areas of the brain that have really been shown to change in response to mindfulness is one, gray matter. So for those that aren't really familiar with that, gray matter is it's kind of like a mush in the brain. It is involved in pretty much everything you need to do: muscle control, sensory perception, including like emotion, speech, hearing, decision making. And it's like this dense thing of neurons, and it contains the cell nuclei of the neurons, hence why it's so useful in these important processes. The prefrontal cortex, which is involved in decision making, amygdala, as we've mentioned, emotional response, and the hippocampus, which is like memory and learning, and people have probably heard of that before. So these are the key areas of the brain that are typically been shown to be impacted by mindfulness practice. So if with those definitions out of the way, I have a really great paper that kind of shows you how mindfulness can impact those things, if that's of interest and makes sense for us to discuss now.
Absolutely. In avoidance of doubt, it's a scientific podcast. So the definitions are welcome.
Great.
And the research papers are definitely welcome. So I'm not going to stop you any further. Let's continue.
Yeah. So this is one I love. It was done by a professor called Sarah Lazar. She's a Harvard professor, and she did two studies back in 2010 and 2011. Effectively, what she did was she did one study where she just looked at long-term meditators and studied using fMRI the effects on the brain. And so the outcome of this study was that long-term meditators have more gray matter in their kind of frontal cortex area of the brain, which correlates to better working memory, improved decision-making processes. Which in itself is a really interesting finding. But the question they then asked themselves was, okay, but this is people who have been meditating for a long time. What about people who have never meditated or have been fairly inconsistent with their meditation? So they followed up again with one of these, and it's really nice that everyone's doing these 8-week programs because it really allows us to see the change or the consistency of mindfulness practice through time. You had John Kabat-Zinn doing it in 1980. Sarah Lazar is doing it in 2010. I have another paper I'd love to mention in a minute. This is 2019. So their second study was essentially taking people who have never meditated. And they did an 8-week course, really similar to the ones I teach. So it involves you meet for 2 hours once a week. You're given homework every day. Typically, the homework kind of cascades from 5 to 10 minutes when you start your first week to up to about 40 minutes at the end. They said they kind of checked, cross-referenced the average that people actually did because, some people probably couldn't be bothered. Some people really tried hard. The average was 27 minutes across everyone. Again, they used fMRI to study the results. They showed that the activity of the amygdala was decreased in response to an emotional stimulus. So, they showed them a distressing image. There was less response from the amygdala, so less induction of the stress response system. And there was more gray matter in the posterior cingulate, which is kind of involved in, it's typically involved in mind wandering processes. So the thought there is that more gray matter allows you better ability to focus, less mind wandering, or should I say refocus, because focus often isn't the problem. You might be focused on work, but then you're suddenly laser focused on something that's not work. It's that ability to bring yourself back. So I think that's a really cool study and talks about some of those biological systems that we have in the brain.
That's fascinating. And I think it's also quite a nice segue to discussion about productivity, right? Because it's connected, like you've just mentioned. You have a biological process that help your body to self-regulate, and also it improves the cognitive powers and focus. That will have a direct impact on productivity. And it kind of nicely takes us back to the main question of the podcast of mindfulness benefits in career, especially in a fast-paced career, like, for example, the ones that we both embarked in, the big technology companies, both at Amazon for 4.5 years. You followed it with a Meta, etc. So maybe, I guess the next good question we could explore together is how mindfulness can actually help big organizations with increasing productivity of the workforce, which would have mutual benefits both for the organization's output and also employee well-being.
Yeah, no, I really do agree with you. I think the benefits are, I guess, from what we've alluded to throughout this conversation, the benefits are pretty clear. If you're, as an individual, if you can kind of increase your, say, intellectual capacity by having better reasoning abilities, your memory could be better. Your perhaps, I think often, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Whenever I interview people, I think that one of the biggest skills that I look out for is your ability to construct and navigate a conversation, in an agile manner, dissect complex topics and then learn from them and kind of turn something quite chaotic into something concise and orderly. But really relationships. I think you can have someone who has never worked in an industry like, and this is what I've done myself. I've kind of jumped through different industries quite a lot. And I felt like the reason I was always able to get these jobs is because I can build a network inside a company really fast. And I think mindfulness has really helped me in going into conversations with no agenda, just understanding what people's problems are, like how they work, how can I help them, how can I listen to them, and understand them beyond this transactional view of them being someone who needs to give me something. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. Like, would you concur maybe that relationship building is this essential facet for navigating big organizations?
I would say for sure. Like you need internal network to solve problems. If you are not likable, and it's not even about being likable. Like if you don't have people to help you out, you are not going to succeed in a 200,000 employee company on your own. Like, let's be honest, it's a social environment, and whether you are an individual contributor, you work cross-functionally and you need to collaborate with other stakeholders. If you are a manager, that's even more complicated. You need to delegate effectively and keep people accountable. And you need to have trust both from your peers, people who report to you, and people you report to. But like when you were answering, I think I've identified like potentially three areas where mindfulness was super helpful for me in particular in my career in big tech. So the first one is the relationships, but it's also because I'm an introvert and I don't want to, promote my podcast, but I also had another episode. So I'm probably going to link that as well in our video, if you don't mind. But it's quite difficult for me to reach out to people, and maybe not difficult, but it's not intuitive for me. It's not my first response mechanism to get to know everyone in the room, get to know everyone on the team and all the other stakeholders. I usually take some time to do it. So mindfulness definitely helps me zoom out from that emotion, calm down, and think, look at things objectively. So then I can do it effectively, and I am genuinely a caring person about others. So I don't have a hidden agenda, but just to be genuine and authentic, mindfulness helps me get to the state where I can do it effectively and communicate with people the way I want to. Then the second thing is about taking responsibility. When I started my career, it was quite easy to get overwhelmed. Worked at Deloitte before, or working at Amazon, with ownership as one of the leadership principles, right? I absolutely love that leadership principle because it allowed me to get so much responsibility and experience. But it's so easy to get overwhelmed when you are given tasks that are beyond your imagination as a graduate. The first response may be, how am I supposed to do it? Like, I am not able to do it. I'm not qualified to do it. And it's a stress trigger for sure. Mindfulness helps you calm down. Mindfulness helps you look non-judgmentally, which you've mentioned earlier, and objectively at the problem. Calm down and then try to figure out how to approach it and how to do it. Structure a chaos into a plan, basically, and identify who you might need help with and how you can succeed. And then the last thing was about problem solving, which I think you've mentioned as well. Problem solving is something that I also look quite heavily when interviewing people to, put a structure into a messy problem, simplify it to get started, to approach it in a structured way. And I think slightly different to responsibility, because responsibility is the moment where you get a task and you are even thinking whether you should take it on or not and just concede. Once you take on the task and then you're working on the project, let's say for 2 months, and then you identify a new thing that changes completely the direction of that project, or there is a stakeholder that doesn't want to implement it a certain way, or you realize that the market is completely different than what you assumed it to be, and you need to go back to the drawing board. That can be an environment where you just panic. You don't know what to do. Everything changes. And then again, mindfulness comes into play because it helps you calm down and look at things the way they are and just find a solution. I think I've mentioned calm down quite a lot now as a self-reflection to my answer. And I think that's the main benefit of mindfulness for me. It's to quiet down the emotions, quiet down the biological responses and the processes in the brain that you've described a few minutes ago, to be able to think clearly. Once I think clearly, everything's possible. And I would say that most of the individuals, professionals in our network and the people that we work with can probably tap into the same benefits. The challenge is to think clearly when a lot of things are going on. So that's my perspective about what I think is important for success, how it reflects my personal experience, and how mindfulness helped me personally on that one. I'm not sure whether there is anything more that you resonate with personally or from your experience, because I'm also mindful, pun. I'm also conscious of the fact that you worked with a lot of people as a mindfulness teacher, right? So you probably have a wider spectrum of cases and challenges that people faced. So it would be interesting to know, within confidentiality, of course, how my answer resonates with the wider population.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd love to share something that came up quite recently. So I'm actually running a mindfulness session next week within Remote, my company at the moment. And as a precursor to that, I sent out a survey for people to complete anonymously that asks a few questions about, how often do you feel stressed at work? And then lists out a bunch of stressors, like how strongly do you identify with these different stressors? And it was interesting that actually remote work, ironically, came up as being a stressor because it can be quite like isolating and lonely. And I think it's a really poignant thing. And maybe as we kind of transition into the next part of our discussion, because I know we were going to speak about how we can help increase adoption of mindfulness in organizations. I think, dealing with remote work is a really important point, because I think it's the future. There probably isn't a startup out there that's not offering hybrid work, at least. So that was a really interesting anecdote. Like, people are stressed because they're isolated, because they have so much screen time, because they don't leave their houses. And I think one of the brilliant things about mindfulness, and it really helped me in this way, was you get comfortable with being with your own mind. And I think we're so overstimulated in this world, with a phone addiction, but even with just like with the doing, we finish one thing, we move to the next thing, and the only time we really rest is at bed, and then in bed, and we struggle to sleep then because it's so relaxing. So I think it's an interesting point that actually mindfulness in organizations needs to help people achieve better balance in a way. And I think one caveat, and like, again, I'm being devil's advocate here just because I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this last point. And it was just because I was digging around in some papers before our call, and there was one review that actually suggested that, and this is terrible for me to say this, but I'm fair. So they suggested that mindfulness could be a inhibitor of performance in organizations, because if you think about it, people are more measured, people are more able to push back, people are more respective of their own time, of their own emotional state. They're not frantically pushing towards deadlines because they know that's probably not healthy for them in the long term. So actually there's an argument to be made that everything slows down. And managers and leaders are more respectful of their employees' times. They ask less. And I don't think this is a bad thing. I don't necessarily think we need to be always looking to achieve more. I think we're going to be around for a long time. I think if we prioritize health and well-being over our populations of employees and managers over productivity, and just shift our timescales out, that's not bad in my eyes. I'm all for health.
I think I'm all for health, and I think it also, the timescale that you've mentioned, I think might be the key to the problem here, because there's a short-term and long-term productivity, right? You can extract a lot of value from the employees for a year or two, in my opinion. And then you have half of the team burnt out. And I think what you have to also consider is sick leaves. Like, I think it's something that I'm trying to understand a bit more, actually. And there is more and more research being done now because of the NHS struggles in UK. So I hope there is going to be more calculations done. But the economic cost of sick leaves is actually being increasing now.
I have a figure for you if you
mainly
want.
because of it. You do?
Yeah. 2 years ago, they estimated that stress leave cost the UK £28 billion. And in
There you go.
2019, it cost the US economy $300 billion, which is shocking. Really shocking, I think.
It's a lot of money, right? Just exactly. So that's, I would say, a short-term productivity focus. That's, in my opinion, not sustainable, because you are losing 28 billion pounds as a country in UK, which could be avoided. And yes, maybe there is going to be less done in a given week or month, but those employees are going to stay longer. They are going to stay focused for longer. They are going to stay productive for longer. And employee retention is also a big problem, right? Like, one thing is sick leaves, but if people are leaving jobs because they are burnt out or they are stressed or they can't cope with it anymore, unless they were underperformers, it's very costly to replace them. It's very costly to hire a new person, onboard them. We probably both know it from our professional experience. So I think, the study is probably saying a good point, but I think the key is going to be in the timescales, in my personal opinion. I don't have much research behind it. I don't have a paper that did the impact of mindfulness on productivity across different timescales. I think it would be very interesting for a PhD work. But my intuition would tell me that in the short term, yes, it might be an inhibitor. But in the long term, I think it's all about sustainable productivity.
Yeah, and again, I do agree with you, and I think maybe a segue into it kind of segues quite nicely into increasing adoption of mindfulness in corporate settings. I'd love to mention an organization that in my opinion is brilliant. It's maybe you've heard of it. It's called Search Inside Yourself.
No, I haven't.
Okay, so I think it was back in 2007. One of the engineers, Shade Mentang at Google, he was a kind of long-term Buddhist meditator, and just realized there was a fundamental problem in organizations about how people showed up in the workplace, and it was all these things that we've been talking about. Seeing people burn out, seeing people go into conversations in such a reactive manner, and so he started Search Inside Yourself, and it was published as a book originally, and now it's turned into a kind of global organization that certifies people to teach the Search Inside Yourself program within their organizations. And I just know this because a friend he was at Google and qualified as a coach, and now teaches in other corporates. But they do loads of great research into the benefits of mindfulness. And I think their last survey they surveyed about 10,000 people across various corporations. And I wrote down a couple of stats somewhere. I don't know where it's gone. I can remember one of them off the top of my head. It was something like 56% of people in this survey group saw there was an increase in using the techniques. So after doing the program, 56% increased the usage of mindful techniques in stressful situations. And 50% of those people had an increase in thinking that they could bounce back after having an emotionally stressful situation. So, it's a really, and this kind of continues into the discussion of what else we can do to perpetuate. I think putting champions trained by organizations like this into companies is fundamental. I think you can talk about it as much as you like, and you can give employees access to portals and things, but unless you have people feet on the ground advocating for these things, knowing these things inside and out, and it needs to be at both ends of the spectrum. You need executive leadership, you need people who have more time to actually do teaching. Yeah, no, I think it's fundamentally, it's hugely important.
Probably want to ask you a bit more about the importance of the program, because the companies I know or the people I talk to, it's pretty much a self-service solution to tap into mental well-being or wellness resources or meditation help. So what I mean by that, individually, we have those apps, Calm, we have Headspace. Personally, They help me a little bit when I use them, but it requires a lot, and I mean a lot of discipline to do it every day. I'm personally, I actually found it more helpful to do Wim Hof breathing as a part of meditation. So I'm not using either of the apps. I just find it very simple to remember the Wim Hof breathing technique. And I just make sure I find 20 to 30 minutes every day, and I just go and do it. I may be slightly overwhelmed or overstimulated, like you've mentioned, with all the possibilities of meditations, etc., to choose from on those apps. And I think it's quite similar as well with the corporate resources. So whether it's Amazon or Meta or some other companies that my friends work in, it's pretty much a page, and you have access to some really good websites and some really good materials. But it's for you to read about, right? Or for you to do when you have a spare time. It still puts quite a lot of responsibility for a person to, learn what they are supposed to do, find the time in their already busy schedule, and then follow those instructions, and then take notes. I'm not saying that everything should be done for people, because I think, it's everyone's responsibility to take care of themselves. But at the same time, maybe there's more support required to drive adoption. And the things you've been mentioning, the 8-week program, the Search Inside the Search Inside yourself, workshops, etc. It sounds like those are the solutions, and also the work you are doing as a mindfulness teacher. Sounds like those are the solutions where you are given some resources, but you also get a structured or personal support, almost like a personal trainer at the gym. It's a personal training or a program for your mental well-being to make sure that you are consistently working with a methodology that's proven, right? And I guess I would love to understand a bit more from your experience the difference it makes to have the structured support. Because personally, I never had a emotion coach or mindfulness coach, or was never part of the program yet. I would be definitely interested in doing something like that. But for myself and the audience, what difference does it make from your experience? I suspect quite a big one, but you are the man to talk about.
Yes.
To talk about it.
Thank you. Yeah, no, happy to give my personal insight on that. So I think, like you, I haven't experienced it to a great degree in organizations where I feel like they've done it the right way. And by the right way, I think, you talk to some of these points. The right way is it's not reactive. It should be more prescriptive. And I know, and I don't see it as being, us spoon feeding people the key to their own happiness, but I feel like actually it's the organization's responsibility, in the same way that organizations really and the working cultures we've built are responsible for breaking down people's mental health. Like, it's not people, I genuinely don't think it's people's fault for not taking ownership of their mental health. They're thrust into companies that are quite unnatural for human beings to work at. We sit at desks and stare at screens all day. That's like not a natural thing for us to do, and we're not taught like kind of proactive ways to heal ourselves. So I think, going back to your point, I think managers need to be educated on how they can engage their employees correctly, check in with them properly, actually it can educate them on the resources that are available to employees, so that they can recommend things when employees are expressing or showing signs of distress or burnout. And I think, to your point of what difference does it make? So I've been involved in many of these 8-week programs, never in the workplace. I've done a kind of ad hoc one-off or duos or trios of workshops, but in the 8-week sessions, I think the thing that really helps you is joint accountability and learning to open yourself up to a group of people that were otherwise strangers. I think it really helps your levels of vulnerability, your if you can say something outside of your own mind, it really helps to process it. So I think, these 8-week programs can be so transformational. It's not a long period of time, but the amount of ground you can cover and the amount that you can get to know yourself is really fantastic. And just the fact that every week for 2 hours, you get together with a group of people who share their own insights, things that work differently for them. And that's something, again, I'd love to hone in on that point specifically, is that, you've tried things and you've been telling me what worked for you and what didn't. You say that you prefer breath work than classical meditation, perhaps in a workplace setting. Some people try Headspace and give up instantly. But imagine if you suddenly had the opinions and the testing of your team or the wider organization, a random selection of people who you're doing an 8-week course with. Imagine that learning and bouncing around these different perspectives. You would be able to hone in on your preferred method so much more quickly. Just because you knew what's out there, you knew what's working for people. You hear all these weird and wacky things that people are trying, and you shift your mind out of the paradigm of, I think, what is the right way to do something, and what is the most, go into the way of like, what is the most effective way for me, and experimentation is key. And so to kind of top that off, I think organizations just need to be better at allowing employees to experiment, giving them the avenues for that, giving them the avenues to share. Does that resonate?
100%. And I think what you mentioned just sparked a new thought in my mind, is almost like those programs take the weight of the individual's shoulder. Individual's shoulders. And what I mean by that is mental well-being seems to be, at least in the past for sure, now it's slightly more popularized as an individual's problem. It's your mind, it's your mental well-being. It's been a taboo for such a long time in the 20th century as well. People had to deal with it by themselves, or even hide with any mental problems. Stress or anxiety were seen as a weakness. Those structured programs, it almost shifts the problem from individual problem to the group problem. They learning from each other what works, what doesn't, helping each other and sharing experiences can be probably, how do you call it, a liberating experience, probably, from the sound of it. So that's probably an additional benefit that those structured programs might provide. It's helping people from being in a state where they feel they have to deal with it themselves to sharing that responsibility and burden with others, which can be more effective.
And releasing the taboo, I think, like you said. I think the fact that mental health is still quite taboo in most workplaces is shocking and wrong and limiting for organizations. So yeah, totally. I'm with you.
Okay, thank you, Josh. We've discussed quite a lot today, from biology of stress and definitions of mindfulness, its benefits, and scientific evidence of helping with depression, anxiety, and stress, and how it affects organizations. So maybe as a wrap, I'm not sure, do you want to give a food for thought for the audience, or a summary of your advice for people and organizations? And then we would wrap it up nicely.
I guess my it's not so much a food for thought as a really important parting learning from a paper that I think is a brilliant paper, if I may share that. And this was,
of course.
So this was out of a brain research lab in New York City, published in 2019. A woman called Wendy Suzuki. She's written a few books. I think her website is wendysuzuki.com if anyone wants to look. So her study looked at people who had never meditated and used fMRI imaging to essentially see what duration of meditation, both what duration of program and what time per day was kind of optimal for the greatest change in brain state. They concluded that 8 weeks, they also did 4 weeks, but 4 weeks did not show anything significant. 8 weeks of 13 minutes a day. And I think that's my key kind of thing I love to get across to people, is that it doesn't have to be like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. From 13 minutes per day, they showed pretty much like 90% of the population showed decreases in negative mood states. They showed enhanced attention, improved working memory, recognition memory, and decreased standard anxiety scores. So I would love to, stress that if you're finding meditation difficult, I think sometimes it can seem like this unattainable mountain to climb, because actually success looks like a monk, levitating in lotus pose. But really, 13 minutes, you don't have to use a program. You can use whatever modality it wants. It can be 13 minutes of walking and focused attention on what's around you. It can be 13 minutes of sitting, looking at a candle. That's kind of something that I just think is really brilliant. And I think people should get engaged in spreading mindfulness throughout their organizations. Look into organizations like Search Inside Yourself. And let's be mindful.
Let's be mindful. Thank you so much, Josh. What a chat.
Alex,
It's been a pleasure.
I really appreciate it, man. I've loved it.
Thank you so much.